Today I want to take a few minutes to talk about one of the emerging pieces of data that seems to connect across the various sites where CARE is doing a work at the global margins within the context of COVID-19, particularly with the broad question of migration and refugee life and livelihood amidst COVID-19. There are three elements in our research that seem to really speak to the necessity for engaging the question of COVID-19 within the broader context of social structures. The first element is in terms of the communicative work of legitimizing precarity of migrant workers and refugees within the everyday cycles and rhythms of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as a form of governmentality works actively through the production of the margins across the globe. So one key element of the neoliberal transformations that we have witnessed both within the global north as well as in the various spaces of global south is the active creation of processes of expulsion, in the words of Saskia Sassen, of displacement in the words of David Harvey, where communities at the global margins are actively worked on in order to expel them from their everyday spaces of life and livelihood. And these spaces then are incorporated into the extractive zones of global capital. So the process of producing expulsion is integral to the expansion of global capital across the globe. And intrinsic to these processes of expulsion is the creation of precarity, because people, households, families, entire communities expelled from their spaces of livelihood in the global south are then incorporated into the mobile pathways of neoliberal capital as floating bodies or as moving bodies. Their movement into the spaces and circuits of capital, into sites of extractive profiteering within the nerve centers of capital, is constituted by then these processes of expulsion. While at the same time that people, households, communities at the global margins of the South are expelled from their spaces of livelihood, the urban spaces, the spaces of production of neoliberal capital are organized in the logics of the free market. Now, essential to this organizing of the logics of the free market is the systematic attack on unions, on collective organizing, on the capacities of workers to have a voice, attacks on social welfare, and attacks on policies that might have anything to do with addressing the needs of those at the margins. This is often accomplished communicatively, based on the argument that one alleviates poverty through the creation of pathways of capital by attacking unions and forms of collectivization which create jobs. So this is sort of the first layer of communicative inversion, the inversion of materiality that is performed by neoliberal hegemony, where the attacks on forms of collectivization, attacks on forms of welfare are narrated as or are storied as pathways out of poverty. So you produce precarity and legitimize that process of producing precarity as poverty alleviation. The second layer of erasure takes place in terms of the language of mobility. So one of the often circulated stories or narratives in neoliberal networks of capital is one of capital creating opportunities. and networks of capital creating opportunities for movement. So we often hear about the migrant worker through mobility, moving out of poverty and into mobility movement into circuits of capital. And this is seen as a way of alleviating poverty. Now, one of the things that COVID-19 makes visible, and this is certainly visible in our ongoing research, whether it is with Bangladeshi workers in Singapore or with internal migrants in India, or speaking with communities in Bangladesh that are sort of experiencing these spaces of movement as opportunities of mobility. The thing that becomes apparent is the gap between, or the fundamental disjuncture between this narrative of mobility and the actual lived experiences of hyper precarity, of struggling with precarious lives without protection, without access to food, without access to decent housing, without access to health and health care, and without access actually to even transportation to get back home. So in our ongoing conversations with migrant workers in India that are stuck in these networks of production, primarily sites of technology and digital innovation that are often sold as the image of a dreamy India. In these narratives, the migrant workers talk about not having access to food, of going without food for many days, of not having access to healthcare, of not knowing when they are able to get back home. For many of them, home provides some sense of respite. So it is that space that they have been expelled from that actually ironically works as an inverted space for hope, as some sort of security for access to food, for access to shelter. And then constituted in this backdrop then is the immobility. For many migrant workers that I've been speaking with over the last month, the opportunity to move, even move back home, is not available. There aren't transportation facilities available. For many migrant workers, they have walked for miles just in order to try to get back home. So fundamentally, mobility is built upon immobility of the precarious classes, and particularly in terms of their lack of opportunities to organize, to be heard as collectives. So even as you have these large numbers of workers that in many ways are imprisoned in these sites of production within cities, that they do not have the fundamental infrastructures of movement, of moving back to spaces where they feel that they could have access to the basic resources of life and livelihood. The second thing then that I wanted to bring up is the narrative of altruism. So propped in the backdrop of these massive inequalities that have become visible, states, transnational corporations, private interests prop up the story of altruism, appealing to kindness, appealing to the human capacity to do good, inviting us to support the workers by drawing upon a narrative of kindness. But this narrative of kindness, this narrative of altruism, we must recognize is pretty much the fundamental infrastructure of neoliberalism, because kindness keeps power structures intact. Kindness articulated as the delivery of services to the now visible migrant workers in our spaces actually obfuscates and erases the necessary conversations on policy changes, on infrastructure changes, and the kinds of transformative policies that we need to put in place immediately as well as in the long term in order to be able to address these fundamental structural issues. So the invitation to kindness in that sense works on keeping power intact in the hands of those that hold the power, while simultaneously erasing and continuing to erase spaces of articulation from the margins, which then brings me to my third point. Across these spaces where the CARE team, our community researchers have been doing our field work, what is evident is the tremendous attack on human agency, on collective agency, and the ability to collectivize, and this sense of fundamentally being erased by not having a voice, by not having a say. Um, I have had multiple conversations with workers in Singapore, for instance, who talk about being scared to say anything. And this is tied to their precarious positions as workers whose work permits are tied to their employers, so the temporary nature of work, but also the nature of the organizing of the work permit that keeps power intact in the hands of the employer. This is also evident in the voices of the workers I have been interviewing in India, who talk about not having a space to voice, who talk about the tremendous police violence, the violence that is being carried out by the police in the name of lockdown, and not really having a space to articulate this violence, to talk about this violence, to challenge it, and to resist it. So what emerges from this picture, at least from the preliminary work that I've been doing and our teams have been doing, is the necessary for building communicative infrastructures, is the necessary for agitating toward communicative equality. So while various band-aid solutions, the organizing of food, the delivery of soaps, are good and are responsive to some immediate problems, they really are band-aids, and we must recognize that. The show of altruism, the show of kindness is going to disappear when this issue disappears. And once again, the migrant workers are going to be made invisible. They are going to be invisibilized and they are going to be erased. The issues are going to move out of the policy agenda. And kindness actually perpetuates that kind of erasure. The narrative of kindness does, because it doesn't really invite us to question the fundamental power inequalities that are constituted within our societies. So this, in many ways, is a moment for us to really think about what are the long-term sustainable solutions for the future. And in the work of the culture-centered approach, we consistently argue that any sense of sustaining issues of structural equality, addressing issues of poverty, addressing issues of access among those at the margins, has to begin by building voice infrastructure. So I invite you to think about the ways in which we can build voice infrastructures now, the ways in which we can sustain communicative equality now, and what are the kinds of policy changes that we need within national and global spaces in order to build and sustain voice equality. Thank you so much for participating, and I do hope that our other members of the research team, our community activists, as well as our community researchers will also come on board to share these insights, and we will bring those to you as well.